Rock's, or rather Davy D. Xebec's true form or power may soon be revealed. Saturn warns Imu that the chaos on God Valley may birth or unleash an entirely new entity or force into the world, and perhaps this incident will be the catalyst for the final showdown between Roger, Garp, and Xebec, set to transpire at the climax of the God Valley incident. Lord Imu's arrival also brings with it some important revelations about the true nature of the world, both past and present, which may reveal that this shadowy puppet master has been pulling the strings behind the scenes since a time long before the Void Century. Chapter 1163 also offers some of the strongest evidence yet in support of theories I've been discussing over the past several years, as we learn that Imu's hatred for the Davy clan is motivated by a broken promise, which likely took place during the Void Century. Critically, I believe Davy Jones made a promise to deliver either Joy Boy, one of the ancient weapons, or perhaps even the One Piece itself, into the hands of Lord Imu, but for reasons lost to the mists of time, maybe even having experienced a last-minute change of heart, Davy Jones failed to fulfill this covenant, thus rendering Imu's world incomplete. The chaos on God Valley continues to unfold in Chapter 1162 as we move closer to the inevitable climactic showdown between Roger, Garp, and Rox D. Xebec. And now, with the arrival of Lord Imu, we're presented with even more questions about the true nature of the epic events which will soon unfold on God Valley, the so-called Island of Fate. With Shocky now safely in Rayleigh's arms, the Rox and Roger pirates instead set their sights on a constellation prize, the Celestial Dragon's Mountain of Treasure, along with the remaining Devil Fruit. We know from the Film Red promotional material that the Roger pirates managed to steal a substantial amount of the Celestial Dragon's treasure, which it would seem includes some of the Devil Fruit being offered as prizes to the Holy Knights. Accordingly, we revisit the scene in which Kuma and Ivankov infiltrate the treasure room, looking for said Devil Fruit. We again see Big Mom snatch the mythical fish fruit from Iva's hands at the last moment, while Kuma manages to scarf his down. This scene is returned to later in the chapter, but we first cut away to the chaos unfolding at the island's center. I was hoping we'd get to see the other lesser Rox pirate members like Kyo, Barbell, Gonzui, John, and Buchan given the spotlight to demonstrate their abilities in combat. And while there's still time for that to happen before the dust finally settles on God Valley, here they remain confined to a single panel. Oddly, the person Silver Axe Kyo is fighting seems to bear a striking resemblance to Marco the Phoenix, though obviously Marco is far too young to have appeared on God Valley. Nevertheless, this character doesn't seem to match the design of any of the Roger Pirates or the Holy Knights, and he doesn't seem to be dressed like a Marine. I highly doubt this is the case, but I do have to wonder if Marco's Phoenix Zone Fruit could have allowed him to regenerate or be reborn from a past incarnation. That said, Marco is currently 45 years old, so I don't know that the dates would line up to make this even remotely plausible. We next see Garp and Bogard racing through the battlefield as Garp communicates with Sengoku via transponder snap. Here we have direct confirmation that neither Garp nor Sengoku were aware that the Celestial Dragon manhunt is a real event, despite both ranking as Vice Admirals at this point in time. Sengoku states that he had only once read a vague rumor in a report filed by a fellow Marine who has since vanished, which is no surprise given the lengths to which the world government has gone to cover up its crimes. We previously saw in Chapter 1160 that Dragon feared his entire platoon would be executed if it were discovered that he had witnessed more than he should have on God Valley. While all of this seems like it should be obvious, given that the average Marine is generally intent on serving justice and protecting the world's citizens without understanding the true evil nature of the world government's overlords, it's still nice to have confirmation that even higher-ups like Garp and Sengoku weren't previously aware of the true depths of the Celestial Dragon's evil. With that said, there are certainly some high-ranking Marines like Ryokugu who wouldn't have any moral qualms about the Celestial Dragon's actions on God Valley, while others like Sakazuki would be willing to overlook the Celestial Dragon's depravity because they believe that ridding the world of piracy is such a noble end that it must be accomplished by any means necessary, even at the cost of likely millions of innocent civilian casualties. I'm really interested to see how Garp and Sengoku will respond to that which they have now directly witnessed in Garp's case and heard from a reliable source in Sengoku's in order to continue serving as Marines for the next 40 years. Sengoku and Garp may even arrive at different conclusions following the events of God Valley, but it's here worth remembering that Garp and Dragon have maintained contact despite the fact that the latter now serves as the leader of the Revolutionary Army. In Chapter 432, Garp revealed that Dragon directly told him that he had seen Luffy off in Logtown, which confirms that the two remain on speaking terms. I'm not really suggesting that Garp directly supports the revolutionary cause, but at the very least it seems that he and Dragon may have more commonalities than was previously assumed. Accordingly, hopefully we'll learn more about their relationship and see them interacting directly for the first time at some point on God Valley. It seems clear that this event marks the end of Dragon's enlistment in the ranks of the Marines, so I'm curious to see if Garp will be as disappointed of his walking the path of freedom fighter as he was of Luffy becoming a pirate. This leads back to the question of whether or not Garp is involved with Sword, or could potentially even be responsible for its creation, as many have speculated over the years. Sword's name was first mentioned by Drake in Chapter 956 when we learned that he had infiltrated Kaido's organization as part of a covert Marine operation. We further learned through the scene that Kobe was also an operative of Sword, though again at that time it wasn't entirely clear what function Sword served or who was responsible for its administration. While I generally agree that there's strong evidence Garp could be involved with Sword, personally I'm still not fully convinced who is responsible for its creation, though the events of God Valley do make that seem at least a bit more plausible. In Chapter 1080, Kuzan stated that members of Sword have officially handed in their resignations, such that they have more individual autonomy while still remaining outwardly part of the Marines. Essentially, members of Sword are free to refuse orders or undertake missions which aren't officially sanctioned, like directly combating the Four Emperors. In fact, it seems this is the primary function Sword has served within the Marines, as the organization takes no official responsibility for the actions of these rogue agents, as they wage a covert war against the Four Emperors. Presumably, generally forbidden because doing so risks destabilizing the New World, and above all, the world government seems intent on maintaining the world's current equilibrium. Despite the fact that Sword agents have handed in their resignations, allowing them to be burned at a moment's notice, with the government completely disavowing any knowledge or involvement in their actions. Outwardly, they still maintain their ranks and are even eligible for promotion. This certainly fits with Garp's general attitude toward authority, and his particular aversion to directly serving the Celestial Dragons. We know Garp already had disdain for the World Nobles prior to the events of God Valley, so it does seem like the latitude afforded to members of Sword would almost be a necessary compromise for him to continue serving as a Marine while also maintaining his personal sense of justice. Essentially, members of Sword are free agents who can serve justice as they see fit while still being afforded the rank and title of Marines. Even the fact that Garp's loyal protégés like Kobe and Helmeppo currently rank as agents of Sword suggests that their mentor could have a guiding hand in this secret organization within the Marine ranks. In Chapter 1081, after being rescued by Garp's squad on Full Lead, Kobe expressed his surprise that Tashigi, a non-Sword agent, was part of this mission to save him. The very fact that he didn't seem to be surprised to see Garp by comparison, and highlighted the fact that Tashigi isn't part of Sword, seems to be a strong evidence that Garp is in fact designated as part of Sword. Further, Aokiji was the first person in the story to fully explain the structure of Sword, and we know he had previously apprenticed under Garp, so it would make sense that he could have been, at the very least, made aware of Sword through Garp, if not recruited directly into its ranks. With that said, Aokiji was also promoted to the rank of Admiral, directly serving under the Celestial Dragons, which would point away from him being a Sword agent. On that note, while it's a distinct possibility that Kuzan has infiltrated the Blackbeard pirates as part of a covert operation, personally I think it would be far more interesting for his character if he joined Blackbeard's crew in earnest. And fortunately, at least for the time being, I think the evidence is pointing in that direction. I'll also add that again, while I think it's very likely Garp could be involved with Sword, it's worth remembering that Smoker has demonstrated a similar attitude toward authority and willingness to break rank without being designated a member of Sword. Accordingly, even Garp's refusal to serve directly under the Celestial Dragons and willingness to defy orders isn't conclusive proof that he's part of Sword. Regardless, there seems to be a common misconception that Sword is a completely clandestine secret society within the Marine ranks, unknown to even exist by the higher-ups of the world government. Certainly the name Sword could imply rivalry or even open hostility towards Cypherpole Aegis Zero, the metaphorical shield of the Celestial Dragons. With that said, we already know that CP0 is fully aware of Sword's existence, and although Guernica's team indeed showed hostility toward Drake, there was no indication that Sword's very existence was meant to be kept secret from Cypherpole. Further, the higher-ups would need to be kept in the loop about Sword for the simple fact that Sword agents' resignations and military codes have already been turned in, and thus, the government must already be prepared to disavow if an agent of Sword is captured or breaks rank. All that is to say, while Sword may not directly serve the world nobles, I don't think they can be fully categorized as a clandestine, subversive sleeper organization within the ranks of the Marines. In that sense, I can envision a scene following God Valley in which Garp attempts to tender his resignation for having witnessed the atrocities committed by the Sustral Dragons. Perhaps in response, he'll instead be allowed to continue serving independently as an agent of Sword. In theory, it's possible this is even the event which will lead to Sword's inception, with Garp then raising up the generation he'll later call the future of the Marines, with the intention of serving true justice. With that said, it seemed that prior to God Valley, Garp was already given the latitude afforded to Sword agents, which could mean that he'd already been inducted into Sword if it existed at that time. We also know that Garp already had disdain for the world nobles prior to the events of God Valley, and had refused a promotion to the rank of Admiral such that he wouldn't have been required to directly serve under their command. Which is to say that while I could see the events of God Valley prompting Garp to join or form Sword, I don't think that the disillusionment displayed in Chapter 1162 is conclusive, as it remains a distinct possibility that Garp had already been serving in that capacity prior to God Valley, perhaps even without Sword designation. In the next scene, we learn that Xebec has already rescued Eris and Teach, and is currently fleeing from Garling and the Holy Knights, while the rest of the Davy clan have succumbed to Imu's Reversi powers. Notably, as far as we've seen, Imu hasn't yet made a personal appearance on the battlefield by way of directly possessing one of the Knights, so I'm interested to know whether the Knights or Saturn have access to said Reversi powers in the same way that they share in Imu's dark magic healing. While it's certainly possible Imu has already possessed Gunko, I think Roger, Garp, and Xebec would have already sensed his earlier advent on the battlefield prior to the end of the chapter. The very fact that they seem surprised at Imu's appearance at the end of 1162 suggests that he hadn't yet appeared on the battlefield in the same way he has on Elbaf. We learn through this scene that the large bearded man wearing a straw hat is Xebec's father, and the older woman is his grandmother, making them Blackbeard's grandfather and great-grandmother respectively. Eris proclaims that she was extended kindness by Xebec's family, and accordingly considers herself to have equally become part of the Davy clan, further highlighting the tragedy of the scene as Xebec, his wife, and child are forced to witness their loved ones turned into monsters by Imu's dark magic. Garling says that the wound he received from Xebec is healing slowly, which reinforces Gaban's statement to the Straw Hats that the Knights aren't immortal. As Kaido said, in the One Piece world, Haki reigns supreme, and fittingly is likely the key to overpowering the Holy Knight's regenerative powers. Interestingly, Xebec says that if a member of the Davy clan were captured, they'd be subjected to agony that makes hell itself seem like a lukewarm bath. We don't yet know what fate will ultimately befall Xebec at the conclusion of the God Valley incident. While Sengoku said that Xebec was killed in combat with Roger and Garp, this line suggests that the world government would instead be intent on capturing and torturing members of the Davy clan given the opportunity. The specific terminology used here invoking hell and torment could reference the underwater prison Impel Down, patterned on the Inferno in Dante's Divine Comedy. And interestingly, in my previous video, I discussed my suspicion that there may have been another yet-to-be-revealed layer to Blackbeard's plan to infiltrate Impel Down, potentially to rescue or absorb an ancestral member of the Davy clan, maybe Xebec, or even Davy Jones himself. In the legend recounted by Robin in Chapter 306, she tells Chopper that Davy Jones was an evil cutthroat pirate from long ago, who made a pact with a demon and was accordingly cursed to reside forever on the sea floor. It's interesting then that the infinite hell of level 6 rests just above the sea floor. Accordingly, going all the way back to when Impel Down was first being published, I wondered if the true bottom level of Impel Down could rest just below the bedrock, the very sea floor where Davy Jones is now supposed to reside. Or in other words, I wondered if there could be a secret level on the sea floor atop which the rest of the prison rests. Even structurally, it seems like the prison should rest on foundations extending down into the bedrock. The fact that Xebec here states that a captured member of the Davy clan wouldn't face death, but rather unbearable torment, could fit with the idea that Davy Jones, having made and broken a pact with the devil during the Void Century, was cursed to reside forever on the sea floor by way of eternal imprisonment on Impel Down's bottom level, kept alive and tormented for centuries. It's interesting that even in legend, Davy Jones isn't said to have died, but instead to have been cursed, and we know that Imu has the power to both grant prolonged life and to take it away at will, as we saw with Saint Saturn, whom we know to have lived for at least 200 years thanks to Imu's magic. Accordingly, I wonder if Imu could have been the one to prolong Davy Jones' life for the sole purpose of extending his agony in the crushing depths of the sea floor. This again fits the symbolism of the Inferno, with the devil and the great traitors contained to the ninth circle or bottom level of hell. The particular disdain Imu has for Davy Jones seems to be rooted in some type of past betrayal. Previously, I speculated that fitting the messianic symbolism used for Joy Boy, the world's first pirate, that he may have had a traitor, perhaps even within his own crew. Much like Judas Iscariot sold out Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, perhaps Davy Jones had a hand in Joy Boy's downfall. However, following this story to its conclusion, the Gospel of Matthew also records that Judas later regretted his betrayal and tried to return the 30 pieces of silver he received in payment. Accordingly, if Davy Jones did indeed sell out Joy Boy, I wonder if he could have later regretted that choice, perhaps after realizing the true nature of the demon with whom he was in league, and thus, at the 11th hour, double-crossed the devil. It seems that Imu's victory in the Void Century was incomplete, as he still only rules secretly from the shadows. In that sense, perhaps Imu's ire toward Davy Jones is so potent because Davy Jones was responsible for preventing his complete victory. The alternative, of course, is simply that Davy Jones was Joy Boy himself, but personally I think there's much stronger evidence for my prior assertion, that Joy Boy and Davy Jones were two distinct individuals, with the latter perhaps first betraying Joy Boy, and then later double-crossing Lord Imu, following at least a partial change of heart. Of course, all of this is entirely speculation for the time being, but it's nevertheless worth considering that Davy Jones, and maybe even Xebec, aren't as dead as one might assume, perhaps even living on in some form directly through Teach. However, if not their souls, then at the very least their wills have been inherited and passed down to Blackbeard. Eris then reveals that she was formerly a pirate, and assures Xebec that she's not helpless, and is accordingly capable of protecting a single child. Xebec reluctantly agrees to split up, allowing Eris and Teach to escape while he makes a stand against Garling and the Knights. Chillingly, Eris assures Xebec that to avert being tortured, if captured, she would first kill Teach and then take her own life, which, while of course is a dark sentiment in and of itself, further reinforces the notion that the Celestial Dragons would prefer to take a member of the Davy clan alive in order to prolong their suffering, which could have significant implications regarding the fates of both Xebec and Davy Jones himself. It also makes me wonder if those members of the Davy clan who succumbed to Imu's Reversi powers, including Blackbeard's grandfather and great-grandmother, could still be in captivity in the present, or were perhaps liberated from Impel Down through Teach. Notably, I previously stated that the concept sketch of Blackbeard's mother from One Piece Magazine 8 didn't match Eris' design, suggesting that Oda had scrapped his previous idea for Blackbeard's mother. But I think I need to correct myself, because upon further examination, I can definitely see some visual similarities, especially accounting for the fact that 38 years have passed within the story, and seemingly more than 20 years in real time since Oda first planned to introduce Blackbeard's mother during Ace's cover story arc all the way back in 2002 or 2003. Before splitting up, Eris promises Xebec that their family will reunite on the island of Leloucha, the very island we know to have recently been destroyed by Imu, now in possession of Dr. Vegapunk's Mother Flame. This is particularly interesting since we know Ace also happened to visit the island of Leloucha during his cover story arc, in search of Blackbeard, the very same island on which Oda had first planned to introduce Blackbeard's mother and sisters. This could indicate that Oda's plan for Blackbeard's family wasn't altered, but rather merely delayed, and accordingly, I have to wonder if Eris indeed managed to survive the events of God Valley and make her way to Leloucha. Based on past patterns in Oda's writing, we've come to expect characters in flashbacks to meet their tragic and untimely demise, and certainly Oda's sketch of a young Blackbeard seems to indicate he lived an unhappy childhood. The very fact that he ended up on Whitebeard's crew at a young age suggests he was orphaned and grew up without a family. With that said, I think Eris could be a prime candidate to subvert reader expectations about flashback character deaths. Her ominous line about the drastic measures she would take to avoid being captured could foreshadow that such a scene may take place in coming chapters. We see in 1162 that Kuma is already hard at work rescuing the innocent people of God Valley, apparently sending them away to wherever they most desire. Thus, I could envision a scenario where a cornered Eris prepares to end Teach's life, only for Kuma to intervene at the last moment. Were that the case, without context, he could easily misinterpret Eris' actions as malicious, and thus send Teach away, leaving Eris no way of rediscovering her missing son, or even knowing where in the world he ends up. This could explain how Blackbeard's mother remains alive, while he seemingly grew up without a family. If that's the case, then Eris could indeed have eventually reached Leloucha, perhaps even by way of Kuma's power, exactly as Oda first outlined in One Piece Magazine 8, perhaps even including two presumably half-sisters for Teach who have yet to appear in the story. On that note, it's interesting that a ship of survivors from Leloucha, including Moda, recently returned with Sabo to the makeshift Revolutionary Army headquarters on Kamabaka. I wonder if Eris, and potentially her two daughters, could be among those survivors, many of whom are now intent on joining the Revolutionary Army. Perhaps significantly, Eris seems to borrow her name from the Greek goddess of strife and discord, which could be fitting if she perhaps becomes an incendiary voice among the revolutionaries, after having survived both God Valley and Leloucha. After all, there's a reason that Nika, and by extension Oda, has selected Luffy as the paragon of freedom and warrior of liberation in the One Piece world, and I'd imagine that while the revolutionaries will ultimately become allies, their methods and ideology may not perfectly align with the Straw Hats, perhaps representing a more extreme faction which crosses the line from pursuit of justice into a desire for violent retribution. Don't get me wrong, the Celestial Dragons are indeed evil tyrants, but we have also seen Oda consistently illustrate the cyclical nature of hatred and vengeance. So from that standpoint, I think Luffy and the Straw Hats better represent the type of justice the world requires to break this iteration of the cycle. From that standpoint, I could envision Eris, in recognition of Xebec and God Valley, championing a more radical version of the revolutionary cause, should she number among the survivors from Leloucha now joining their ranks. In any case, while the particular details are speculative, I do think there is a reasonably strong chance Eris could have survived God Valley, with her past life as a pirate prior to marrying Xebec left as a potentially interesting story to explore in the future. She also seems to be confident that she can protect Teach from the Holy Knights, which could also indicate that Eris is capable of holding her own in combat. In the next scene, we learn that contrary to her promise, Big Mom intended to gift the mythical fish fruit to her son Katakuri in order to bolster the strength of her future crew, going back on her word to Kaido. To the first point, it's worth noting that according to the Viver cards, Katakuri had already eaten his Mochi Mochi fruit around the age of 5, so he should be incapable of eating the mythical fish fruit by the time the God Valley incident took place. This could mean that the Viver card is simply inaccurate, but I also think it would be perfectly fitting if Katakuri already wields the Mochi Mochi fruit without Big Mom's knowledge. I could certainly imagine her not being attentive enough to realize that her son has already consumed a devil fruit. On a related note, I think it's highly likely Oda will draw Katakuri wielding the mythical fish fruit either in a future SBS or One Piece magazine illustration. Further, while it's not particularly surprising that Big Mom had no intention of sticking to her promise to give Kaido a devil fruit, it further highlights the fact that Kaido has been consistently denied the true friendship he's yearned for in the deepest parts of his subconscious. In chapter 1025, the only time Kaido's emotions reached a true fever pitch in the rooftop battle, he told Yamato that ogres aren't meant to be friends with humans, a conclusion he reached predicated on decades of past trauma. In the present, Kaido is a man at war with himself. His conqueror haki grows more powerful while inebriated, because his true will, desire, and ambition only bubble to the surface when his inhibitions are suppressed. At his deepest level, Kaido wants friends, but he believes that being an ogre makes that impossible. His current persona, or shell, has been adopted as a coping mechanism to repeated past trauma, and accordingly, he remains out of tune with his zone fruit and unable to awaken its power. While a topic for a separate video, I think this means that after being defeated in combat by Luffy, or as Kaido refers to him, the return of Joy Boy, Kaido has the potential to re-emerge as a very different person, perhaps even one capable of awakening the true power of the mythical Azure Dragon. In any case, we even saw back on Wano that Kaido seemed to have deeper emotional attachment to Big Mom and a stronger sense of genuine camaraderie than was reciprocated. In a way, he really does come across as the younger sibling of the Rock's crew, who hasn't been fully accepted as a peer by his older crewmates. Linlin reneging on her promise to give Kaido a devil fruit, yet another in the long line of betrayals he's experienced during his life, only serves to reinforce Kaido's preconceived notion that ogres and humans can't ever truly be friends. We then see parallel scenes of Eris and Dragon trying desperately to carry young Teach and Shanks to safety respectively, which again, as discussed in numerous past videos, serves to highlight the fact that Shanks and Blackbeard are inherently linked by fate, which will ultimately culminate in their imminent clash in the not-so-distant future. We can assume that a considerable amount of time passes in between these scenes, perhaps several hours, as we know that Saturn's confrontation with Kuma, pictured in chapter 1096, took place amidst the chaos unfolding in chapter 1162. Saturn now sits high up on a hill, surveying the battle as he converses telepathically with Lord Imu. Imu inquires if Xebec has been killed yet, though Saturn can't say for certain. Interestingly, however, Saturn cryptically responds that if the chaos and destruction on God Valley is allowed to continue, they risk something entirely new being born, to which Imu responds that this cannot be allowed to happen, which, as we'll see at the close of the chapter, prompts Imu's direct intervention. It's unclear exactly what Saturn is referring to here, but the birth, awakening, or unleashing of this new entity, be that a person or something else, is extremely interesting, and could represent the twist to which I alluded in my previous video. To reiterate the key points from the previous discussion, Roger, Xebec, and Garp aren't currently placed on a collision course, and thus, it's unclear what chain of events could possibly lead to the clash Sengoku described in chapter 957. While it's certainly possible that Imu's Reversi power could be used to flip Roger, Garp, or perhaps most likely Xebec, I don't think any version of this scenario fits perfectly with what we learned in 957. And personally, I feel that were Imu responsible for somehow puppeteering the battle between Roger, Garp, and Xebec through possession or demonification, it would undermine Xebec's role as Roger's first and greatest foe. I'm also just not convinced that Reversi answers all the lingering questions about Roger, Garp, and Xebec's duel. If Xebec is flipped to the dark side, he would then be fighting on the side of the world government, which means that in taking a stand against Demon Xebec, Garp would be fighting directly against the world government's interest. I don't really see how Garp, fighting directly against Lord Imu, and a newly possessed asset in the form of demonified Xebec, would earn Garp his title of Marine Hero. In fact, I'm not even sure he'd be allowed to continue living, much less serving as a Marine Vice Admiral. Moreover, killing Xebec and putting an end to the chaos on God Valley is the main reason Imu has personally intervened. If killing Xebec is Imu's primary target, I think it's doubtful that possessing Xebec and pitting him against Roger and Garp would be a particularly effective strategy. In my previous video, I highlighted the fact that although Xebec has rightly diagnosed many of the evils of the world government, the solution he offers is also poison. Thus far, the events of God Valley have led us to the conclusion that Xebec is simply a family man whose sole intent is to rescue his wife and child from the evil celestial dragons. And, as expected, his love for his family is indeed genuine. From that standpoint, I'm not saying that Xebec is the vile, heartless monster talked about in legend, but the brand of piracy he champions is nevertheless antithetical to those like Luffy, Roger, and by extension JOYBOY. All of which is to say that as a man who desires to become World King himself, Xebec is no hero or champion of freedom. He's simply not a heartless monster, and his love for his family is genuine, even to the extent that he would put his own life and ambition on the line to keep them safe. From that standpoint, I think it's safe to conclude that Xebec has indeed at least been partly mischaracterized, but I think it would be more accurate to say that he simply wasn't fully understood based on Sengoku's story. There were more facets to Xebec's character than we were led to believe. I think it's far more accurate then to compare Xebec to the other emperors like Kaido and Big Mom, both of whom are complex and nuanced characters, whose misguided evil ambitions are rooted in their traumatic backstories, making them fundamentally tragic figures, despite their villainous actions. I think the same can then be said for Rox or Davy Xebec, and accordingly, despite the fact that Imu and the Celestial Dragons are worse by comparison, Xebec's ambition is still to take Imu's throne for himself, which gives Roger reason to stand against him even without Imu's demonic Reversi intervention. And accordingly, this long preamble leads to the question of what Saturn means when he says that the chaos unfolding on God Valley risks birthing or awakening something in the world, which in turn causes Imu to intervene directly. This leads back to my assertion that Imu failed to achieve a total victory during the Void Century, despite his currently occupied lofty perch atop the empty throne, and accordingly, I believe he's still secretly working behind the scenes toward his true ultimate goal. The butterflies surrounding Imu in the Chamber of Flowers could even symbolize the idea that Imu remains in a chrysalis state, and hasn't yet achieved his true final form. The ongoing work to complete megastructures like Tequila Wolf and the other bridges could also be in service of this yet unrealized ambition. The very fact that pirates still seek treasure at the end of the sea and can rise up to challenge Imu and the nobles in any way would seemingly verify that Imu's conquest remains incomplete. If his goal is absolute control, it's clear that hasn't yet been achieved, and thus, I think it's reasonable to conclude that Imu must still be working behind the scenes toward achieving this yet unrealized objective. In the present, we've also seen Imu equally deface the images of Shirahoshi, Luffy, and Blackbeard, suggesting that these three individuals each have some role to play in bringing about Imu's defeat and the world's liberation. In that spirit, we saw the elders desperately attempt to intervene on Onigashima to prevent the advent of Nika, when they began to suspect that Luffy's Devil Fruit awakening was imminent. Interestingly, Saturn's warning here is actually highly reminiscent of the scene in which the elders discussed their concern that Luffy's fruit was about to awaken, and accordingly ordered Guernica to take preventative action. Ironically, by interfering in Luffy and Kaido's battle, instead of allowing things to play out naturally, the elders may have even indirectly contributed to Nika's awakening. So, accordingly, I wonder if their actions on God Valley will again inadvertently play a role in bringing their fears to fruition. Now, exactly what form that takes remains a mystery, but I wonder if it could have something to do with the curse inflicted on Davy Jones. In the previous discussion, I suggested that Xebec could seize an opportunity to take the devil fruit he set his sights on, but now wonder if this birth or awakening could instead be the event which triggers the climactic battle between Roger, Garp, and Xebec. Again, I'm not exactly sure what that birth or awakening might represent, but perhaps means drawing out some latent power or persona residing in Xebec, or even young Teach. I've speculated that the will, spirit, or even body of Davy Jones could live on, and potentially re-emerge, and maybe that's what's being discussed here. But Saturn specifically worries about the birth of something entirely new. So I'm more inclined to think that perhaps much like Shirahoshi represents the rebirth of Poseidon, some ability or power which once resided in Davy Jones is about to be reborn or reawakened, through either Xebec or Blackbeard. Most likely Xebec. This power or entity, perhaps much like Poseidon and Nika, will be instrumental in liberating the world from Imu's grasp, and foiling his yet unrealized master plan, thus explaining why Imu is so adamant that this birth or awakening must be prevented at all costs. If, on God Valley, this power awakens in Xebec, it seems likely that by the time we reach the present, it's been passed down to Blackbeard, explaining why his image, along with Luffy's and Shirahoshi's, was cut to pieces on the floor of Imu's chamber. Whatever power, entity, or ability Blackbeard possesses, giving him a strange body as Marco described, could be a necessary companion or complement to Shirahoshi's Poseidon power and Luffy's awakened Nika Devil Fruit. This further reinforces my belief that while Luffy and Teach will certainly battle for the title of Pirate King, the two are ultimately destined to reconcile their differences and eventually join forces, healing an 8 centuries old schism in the pirating world, which perhaps first began with Joy Boy and Davy Jones. We learned through Dr. Vegapunk that Joy Boy was the first person on the seas to be called pirate, which means that the Jolly Roger was likely first raised as a symbol of freedom, in defiance of the tyrannical forces of Joy Boy's era. However, unfettered freedom can be used to do either good or evil, and I believe we see this reflected in the moral spectrum of pirates currently sailing the seas in the One Piece world. Accordingly, it seems likely that the first wave of piracy in Joy Boy's era was similarly filled with individuals each possessing their own moral outlook and using the Jolly Roger to pursue freedom in their own way. In the pilot version of Romance Dawn, Oda even considered using formalized terminology to describe two brands of piracy, with free-spirited adventurers called peacemains, while greedy Morganeers more closely align with the cutthroat and bloodthirsty pirates of legend. I think it was a wise choice to instead allow readers to intuit the morality of a character based upon their actions. But these ideas have nevertheless carried through to the serialized story of One Piece, as we can recognize that pirates like Luffy, Roger, and presumably Joy Boy have a distinct moral code, which stands in contrast to those like Blackbeard, Big Mom, Kaido, Xebec, and presumably Davy Jones. This all relates back to the central theme of the broader story of One Piece, namely the pursuit of freedom. Importantly, theme and narrative is a question, rather than an answer. In the case of One Piece, in simplest terms, the question is, how does a person pursue freedom? And Roger's thesis statement, referenced in Chapter 100, most clearly communicates the proposed answer: an inherited strength of will, a person's dreams, the destiny of an age. As long as people seek freedom, these things will not vanish from the earth. Essentially, Roger asserted that the immutable forces of inherited will, dreams, and fate will continue to guide the world as long as people seek freedom, and these ideals are meant to serve as the underpinning for piracy, symbolized by the Jolly Roger. Roger believed these forces would guide his successor in pursuit of said freedom, to rediscover One Piece and rise up as the warrior of liberation the world has awaited for centuries. Going back to the dawn of this ancient conflict, we know that Joy Boy was the first person called pirate, and although his efforts to liberate the world ultimately failed, his friends and allies from around the world, along with their descendants, have patiently guarded the treasure and the true history, awaiting the promised day when, guided by the forces of destiny, inherited will, and dreams, the right person arrives at the right time to take up Joy Boy's mantle as warrior of liberation. However, like any good hypothesis, this thesis must be rigorously tested, and that's exactly what Luffy's journey through the Grand Line represents. The One Piece is safely guarded at the very end of the sea, and any who seeks this legendary treasure of treasures must not only be physically capable of surviving the rigors of the voyage, but must also make friends and allies of those who guard the road poneglyphs, as well as the ancient weapons, in order to chart the course to Laugh Tale. It's no mystery then why Luffy's greatest strength is his ability to make friends and allies wherever he goes. This filtering system is designed to test candidates to inherit the title of Pirate King for the very qualities Roger asserted will guide the world toward freedom, and accordingly, if the right person, Luffy, successfully arrives at Laugh Tale to claim the One Piece, this filtering system will have served its intended function, and Roger's assertion will have been verified as true. Joy Boy's faith will have been rewarded. However, should the wrong person arrive to claim the One Piece, someone like Blackbeard, morally unscrupulous and devoid of Roger and Luffy's code of honor, Roger's assertion and his trust in these immutable forces would seemingly prove false, and the hopes of those who've guarded the path for centuries will have been in vain, as they will have failed in their mission to pass on the closely guarded key to turning the world upside down to the right person, and will have instead allowed the One Piece to fall into the wrong hands. Essentially, the system set up to guard and preserve the One Piece for 8 centuries will have ultimately failed. All that is to say, the other contenders to inherit the One Piece, the reigning and former emperors like Buggy, Kaido, Big Mom, Shanks, and Blackbeard, serve to challenge the central themes of the story. They essentially serve as the shadow archetype, a reflection of the central protagonist, representing the dark potential of the ideals which drive piracy in the One Piece world. They're guided by the same general principles as Luffy: pursuit of individual dreams, the guiding hand of fate, and a strong inherited will passed down to them from a mentor or other influential figure. Yet these characters, each corrupted by a tragic flaw, were they successful in their quest to claim the One Piece for themselves and become the Pirate King, would create a distorted version of the new world Joy Boy envisioned. When Luffy emerges as the Pirate King and claims the One Piece, it will represent not only a personal victory, but also the symbolic triumph of the Peacemain brand of piracy, championed by Roger and Joy Boy. The ongoing throne war in the New World decides not only the individual who gets to wear the Pirate King's crown, but also the very ideals symbolized by the Jolly Roger, in opposition to the tyrannical forces led by Lord Emu. My belief then is that once Luffy emerges as the Pirate King, and his brand of piracy comes to define the Jolly Roger, the other emperors currently vying for that title will at the very least form a grudging respect for the Straw Hats. After all, we've seen that although the various pirates who form the Rock's crew aren't bound by the same degree of camaraderie and friendship as are the Straw Hats, they at least acknowledge a sort of pirate code, even if it's more what you'd call guidelines than actual rules. Even Blackbeard, following defeat, may thus be willing to play a supporting role in liberating the world from Imu's grasp, and if my speculation is correct, the power or entity soon to be born or unleashed on God Valley could be necessary for Luffy to achieve victory. The evidence would suggest that Joy Boy gathered these so-called ancient weapons for the purpose of combating the tyrannical forces of his age. After all, as Neptune told Roger, any weapon depends on how it's used. This theme was even directly addressed on Water 7 through Frankie's flashback, as his battle Frankies, built with no ill intention, were misused by the world government to frame Tom. Accordingly, the ancient weapons, despite their destructive power, may have been built or gathered for noble intention. So with that in mind, if the Davy clan wields or possesses some ancient power or force which Imu and Saturn now fears about to be unleashed or reborn due to the unfolding chaos on God Valley, much like Shirahoshi's ability as Poseidon to communicate with Sea Kings, this mysterious power was likely originally intended to aid in the world's liberation, and accordingly, if this power now rests with Blackbeard, this would further reinforce the notion that Teach is ultimately destined to become an ally in the final war. It's also interesting to note that Saturn specifically attributes the chaos on God Valley as a potential trigger for the birth of this something entirely new, which may be significant when we consider the world government's emphasis on maintaining the world's current equilibrium. As noted, Imu's conquest seemingly remains incomplete. I can't imagine that a person who would call himself World King is happy to rule secretly from the shadows, especially while the territories controlled by the Four Emperors are decidedly not under his control. Yet at this point in time, the government seems more intent on preventing turbulence or chaos than it does on conquering the remainder of the world. Given the nature of Imu and the Celestial Dragons, this clearly isn't rooted in a benevolent desire to improve the quality of the world or to leave those who don't wish to join the world government to their own devices. That is to say, we have every reason to suspect that the world government would prefer to have absolute and complete control over the entire world, and would rather not suffer the existence of the Four Emperors if they had a choice. We know that the government wants to expand its sphere of influence, as we've seen how they brutally take control of non-affiliated territories like God Valley. The very fact that they haven't actively sought to conquer the Four Emperors, but have rather focused their efforts on maintaining equilibrium, seems contradictory to the world government's nature. As we've recently learned, the designation of Emperor isn't used solely to emphasize the degree of power wielded by those four particular pirates, but is officially conferred by the world government to classify the most influential figures in the New World as off-limits for direct confrontation, specifically because they believe going to war with the Emperors threatens the world's equilibrium. The Warlords, and later Seraphim, were sanctioned not to eliminate the Emperors, but rather to serve as a continuous check against the expansion of their power, and thus to maintain the world's current structure. From this we can determine that the key factor in the equation for deciding whether or not the world government takes direct action against a potential threat to their authority seems to be whether or not they consider doing so risks causing turbulence or disorder. Even recently, at the start of the Reverie, Nostromo said that the time for a great cleansing was approaching, because the world government has for the past 2 years failed to return the world to its homeostasis in the wake of Whitebeard's death at Marineford and the rise of Blackbeard. Since then, things have only gotten progressively more volatile, as Luffy and Law broke the gears of power on Punk Hazard and Dressrosa by dismantling Doflamingo's organization, followed by the Worst Generation's triumph over Kaido and Big Mom on Wano. Even the government's efforts to replace the Warlords with the seemingly more loyal Seraphim can be viewed as the direct cause of the advent of Crossguild. Their attempt to pin the blame for Cobra's death on Sabo only served to inspire the Eight Nation Revolt. On Egghead, their efforts to eliminate Dr. Vegapunk ultimately resulted in his message being spread throughout the world. Perhaps most significantly, Nika's awakening has introduced a chaotic and unpredictable variable into the mix, which the government has failed time and again to anticipate or control. We've seen repeatedly that the more the government has tried to tighten its grip to maintain its illusion of control, the more they've unintentionally destabilized the very order they're trying so desperately to maintain. The government, and by extension Imu, don't yet seem to have all that they want. The apparatus that is the world government is essentially designed to serve Imu's interest, and while that organization seems to be in the process of failing, I don't believe that simply maintaining his current level of power for as long as possible is Imu's endgame. The stability or equilibrium created by the world government seems to be maintained such that Imu's true master plan remains undisturbed and unchallenged. We saw a similar setup on Skypiea, where the Shandorans and Skypieans were locked in an intractable stalemate. Eneru didn't seek to end the conflict or simply conquer the Shandorans, because then the Skypieans might set their sights on him instead. Rather, for as long as it suited him, he maintained the status quo, or the equilibrium of continuous conflict, neither side emerging as the victor, so that behind the scenes, Eneru, an outside agitator, along with his true cult of loyalists, could secretly extract the gold from Jaya's lost city and construct their arc Maxim, thereby allowing Eneru to ascend to live on the endless Vars. It's no coincidence that Eneru is a villain much in the same mold as Imu, one who already believes himself to be divine, but still seeks an even loftier perch. On that basis, I think it would be incorrect to say that Imu merely rules the world government, but rather would say that the world government is an apparatus or instrument designed to serve Imu's interest. Imu doesn't view himself as the head of the world government, but rather stands above it. The entire organization, including the Celestial Dragons and Five Elders which sit at its apex, is merely an instrument to be used as Imu sees fit. He pits the world government against the pirates, revolutionaries, and any others who would rise up to challenge the government's authority, and thus maintains equilibrium, an intractable stalemate such that the conflict continues without end. It's worth noting here that while the Celestial Dragons are currently living the high life in Marijois, they're simply too blind to see that they too are ultimately disposable in the eyes of Lord Imu. When Eneru finally completed his golden arc and began ascending to the heavens, he set to destroy everything in his wake, including the Skypieans who served him out of fear. This would perhaps indicate that when Imu approaches the completion of his ultimate ambition, the days of the Celestial Dragons and Five Elders will be numbered, just as Saturn was discarded as an empty husk following the events of Egghead. Here on God Valley, Saturn and Imu's words indicate that chaos or turbulence risks birthing or awakening a power or entity which lies dormant, but could rise up to challenge the world government's authority and thus undermine Imu's secret ambition. Again, this is all speculation, but in any case, I still suspect that Roger and Garp will have a valid reason to stand and fight against Xebec. Imu's arrival would seem to indicate that either Roger, Garp, or Xebec will be turned into a demon and compelled to fight, but rather, I think this birth or awakening alluded to by Saturn and Imu could instead be the event which makes defeating Xebec an imperative for Roger and Garp. Any weapon depends on how it's used, and while I believe it's likely this power or entity soon to be born on God Valley is ultimately intended to be used as a companion to Nika, Poseidon, and the other weapons JOYBOY gathered to liberate the world, this power could also be misused in the wrong hands. While Xebec isn't the heartless monster previously described, he's also a person who has set his sights on the empty throne, and has shown himself to be morally unscrupulous during the reign of rocks. And thus, while Imu remains the greatest threat to the world, Xebec coming to possess a power commensurate with an ancient weapon would also turn him into a very grave threat, not only to Imu's reign, but to the broader One Piece world. And accordingly, I think this could be the spark prompting Roger and Garp to take their stand against rocks, just as Sengoku described. As the scene continues, we see Kaido put his newly acquired Azure Dragon power to use for the first time, arriving to stand side by side with Xebec and Whitebeard. The mythical Azure Dragon immediately makes any scene in which it appears more epic, and the final panel of chapter 1162 is no exception. Imu takes direct possession of Saint Saturn, which confirms that while Gunko has served this function on Elbaf in the present, there's nothing special or unique about her relationship to Lord Imu or her designation as devoted Blade of God, which allows her to serve as Imu's vessel. Though it should also be noted that Gunko is the only one of the knights, aside from the elders, who is shown not to have aged over the past 38 years, so she may still have a deeper covenant with Imu than do the regular Holy Knights, and thus, I don't think we can say for certain that any given knight can be possessed by Imu directly, even if they all seem to have some of his dark magic powers, including regeneration. Imu's arrival immediately catches the attention of Roger, Garp, and Xebec, the three key players destined to clash in the climax of the incident, which means that at the very least, this event will likely trigger the chain of events which lead the three to assemble. Again, going back to the idea that Xebec isn't a heartless monster, and instead adheres to at least a loose code of ethics, he tells Whitebeard and Kaido that they don't have any obligation to stand by his side at this point in time, as there's nothing to be gained in doing so. At the very least, he's honest in the fact that there's no tangible benefit to them helping Xebec wage his personal crusade against Lord Imu, though the ever-honorable Whitebeard remains committed to stand by his captain's side, even though his joining Rocks was compelled by way of Davy backfight. Here Whitebeard asks Xebec what exactly they're up against, to which Xebec responds, "If I had to call it anything, I'd say that represents the world." The use of the definitive article "the" before the word world makes it seem as if Xebec is defining the world as an entity or power rather than a symbol or representation of Imu as the apex of authority, which notably recontextualizes many past scenes, as well as the broader conflict of the story as a whole. First, going back to a topic I discussed in my previous video, at the conclusion of chapter 1156, Xebec told his crew that they had a choice whether or not to follow him on the fateful day of their mission, but assured them that if they stood by his side, he'd show them the peak of the world. Xebec's genuine care for his family means it's unlikely he directly orchestrated the events of God Valley, as it's hard to imagine he'd intentionally put Eris and Teach in harm's way. But nevertheless, this confrontation with Lord Imu seems to be exactly the event Xebec referred to when he told the Rocks pirates that he would show them the peak of the world. And accordingly, whether planned or unplanned, the God Valley incident has become the fateful day of Xebec's mission. And accordingly, I think we could soon see just how far Xebec is willing to go to realize his ambition, perhaps crossing a line that Garp and Roger can't abide. On Egghead, Van Augur told Saturn that the Blackbeard pirates have set their sights on the world, again using the definitive article "the" in front of world, which communicates the notion that Augur wasn't here referring to mere conquest or rulership, but rather the acquisition of a specific entity, power, or person. This further indicates that Teach, also a student of history, seems to have Xebec's same awareness of Imu's identity, and thus, Augur's line serves much the same function as Xebec's infiltration of the Chamber of Flowers, a direct declaration of war against not the world government, but rather the shadowy figure which sits atop the empty throne in secret. The word world is used fairly commonly, so I don't want to go too crazy reinterpreting past scenes, but there are still a few other notable lines which now seem to hold deeper meaning in light of this revelation. In chapter 100, after rescuing Luffy, Dragon cryptically told Smoker that the world is awaiting their answer, which, given the fact that not only have the Revolutionary Army set their sights on unseating the Celestial Dragons, but that Dragon himself witnessed the events of God Valley, makes me wonder if Dragon here could also be referring to this entity or power defined as the world. With that said, we know from the fact that Dragon and Ivankov were surprised by Sabo's revelations from the recent reverie that Dragon remained unaware of Imu's existence. So at most, Dragon may have had a vague understanding that a dark power controls the world, but if so, he didn't know that it resides in a specific individual. Perhaps more significantly, at the climax of Marineford, in his dying breath, Whitebeard told Sengoku and the world government to be prepared for the day when the One Piece is rediscovered, because when the treasure is found, the world will be flipped upside down. On God Valley, Whitebeard was directly told that an Imu-possessed Saturn may be described as the world, and though we don't know exactly how much he told him, at the very least, Roger shared with Whitebeard the meaning of the name D, after having learned the true history on Laughtail. So Newgate's words here were likely informed by at least partial knowledge of the world's lost history, and potentially the true nature of the world's evil ruler. Thus, when Whitebeard says the entire world may be flipped upside down, he could be referring to Imu. This line is even more interesting when you consider Imu's Reversi powers to flip pieces from light to dark, the Celestial Dragons and other villains in their mold have repeatedly turned their acts of conquest and violence into twisted and bloody games. So in that sense, you might even consider Imu's dominion over the world to be a similar evil game being played on a much larger scale. Even the massive organization that is the world government is merely a piece on the game board flipped to the dark side in service of Lord Imu. But the one piece, perhaps the key piece on said game board, will flip the world upside down, symbolically bringing it back into the light. This could indicate that the world is a counterpart to the One Piece, symbolically flipped to the dark side and used to do evil. The One Piece will flip the world back to the light, perhaps stripping the evil entity that is Lord Imu, or possesses Lord Imu, of the world, the means by which she holds the reins of power. In chapter 1069, Vegapunk offered his hypothesis about the true nature of Devil Fruit, stating that their users exist in different dimensions of reality, which embodies a person's dream for a potential future branch of humanity. While he didn't use the precise term, this could also be interpreted to mean that Devil Fruit users occupy their own worlds. In an awakened state, the domain of Devil Fruit grows, as the will or dream they embody expands its sphere of influence beyond the wielder's body, to begin transforming the world around them and even other people. Haki or willpower is the true underlying power system in the One Piece world. As Kaido said, Haki reigns supreme, and accordingly, even powers which transform others can be overcome through strong enough will. For example, this was recently demonstrated by Law and the Heart Pirates against Doc Q. In theory, a strong enough awakened power or will could expand its sphere of influence or its domain, overpowering a large number of individuals, potentially even the entire world. While I'm not saying for certain that Imu is merely wielding an immensely powerful Devil Fruit, described as the world, I think it's a valid hypothesis that the immortal king, Nerona Imu, one of the founders of the world government, came to be possessed by an awakened zone, which embodies the will or even soul of a primordial demonic entity, much as Luffy and Joy Boy before him awakened the power of Nika. Zone Fruit seem to possess a particularly strong willpower of their own, which can completely consume and overcome the consciousness of its wielder in an awakened state, as we saw with the Jailer Beasts in Impel Down. On Egghead, even Lucci began to lose his grip on his awakened zone power the longer his fight with Luffy dragged on. Accordingly, recognizing that Luffy's personality had shifted after awakening Nika, Kaido asked Luffy who he is, seemingly attempting to verify whether or not Luffy remained in the driver's seat. With that in mind, I think it's possible that Imu, once a mortal king, has had his consciousness and will completely consumed and overridden by that of an awakened zone, which of course begs the question of exactly who or what Imu really is, and while that remains a topic too big to cover in this video, there seems to be ample evidence that he represents a type of demon, one who, much like the devil, a fallen angel, seeks to make himself God. On that note, given the use of the term world to describe Imu, and the fact that Marijois sits atop the red line, seemingly the Serpent of Hellfire described in the Harley text, it may be tempting to assume that Imu embodies the power of the Earth God. And while I don't think that can be completely ruled out, I personally think it's unlikely, as the term the world encompasses more than just the elemental power of Earth. Further, the Serpent of Hellfire unleashed on the first world by the Earth God isn't framed as a malicious act, but rather a vengeful form of divine retribution wrought upon humanity for its greed in attempting to control the forbidden fire within the Earth. Thus, the Earth God doesn't seem to be the villainous force of this ancient verse. It's notable that despite the fact that the Harley describes the intervention of divine guardian figures, there's no explicit mention of the demonic entity Imu seems to embody, pictured on the left side of the mural, a topic I'll touch on later in the discussion. The quartet of deities referred to in the Harley, sun, earth, forest, and sea, all symbolize classical elements, viewed as building blocks used to construct the world and substantiate life, and thus, the connotation of describing Imu as the world suggests that he symbolizes, or claims dominion over, all building blocks of life and society, and wouldn't be merely counted as one among a group of four, equal in power or influence with Nika, the forest, and sea gods. This is again another topic I'll expand upon more in the future, but it's interesting to note that earlier in Harold's flashback, Estrid invokes the names of the classical elements during her use of geomancy, based on a real-world divinatory practice, with both Eastern and Western permutations. It's even more interesting in this context that the demon summoning circle used by the people of Namakura Island was patterned on Leibniz's representation of the universe built on the Greek classical elements of earth, water, fire, and air, to which Aristotle added the fifth element of ether or celestial wind. This same symbol is seen inside the Chamber of Power, and the world government's emblem is comprised of 5 connected circles, perhaps representing the 5 elements. If so, Imu, or the power he channels, could embody or symbolize the emergent 5th element of ether, or celestial wind, perhaps fittingly analogous to the Eastern elemental formulation, which instead uses void as its 5th element. Perhaps not so coincidentally, Imu refers to himself as Mu, or nothingness, and the time period in which he rose to power is referred to as the Void Century. All of which leads back to potentially the most interesting implication of Xebec referring to Imu as the world, as we re-examine the meaning of the 3 worlds described in the Harley text on Elbaf. Fully dissecting the Harley is too large in scope for this particular video, but we can at least touch on a few highlights. Ja Rule said that the Harley is an ancient text of unknown origin, and that the vague nature of its poetic verses leaves it open to multiple interpretations. On its surface level, the 3 verses referring to the 3 worlds outline 3 distinct epochs or periods of time. And that is certainly true, as it very clearly describes a sequential set of events. Thus, we can interpret from this text that there were 2 epochal shifts marking significant inflection points in One Piece world history. This is actually a topic I've covered at length in the past, even prior to the revelation of the Harley. But the very fact that the world's current dating system, Kaienreki, or the Age of the Sea Circle, predates the Void Century by roughly 600 or 700 years, indicates that this conflict began long before Joy Boy's era. In short, I think the first world likely corresponds to Tenreki, or the Age of Heaven, which ended roughly 1500 years before the present, at the dawn of the Sea Circle calendar. The second world ended with the Void Century, and the rise of the world government, while the third world is ongoing. Yet we also know that the Giants interpret the 3 worlds to describe the 3 tiers of Elbaf, as Loki referred to the underworld as the first world. By extension, this would mean that the Sun Realm could be described as the second world, and the yet unexplored Astral Realm would be the third. The first world is really the island itself, while the second world, the Sun Realm, is built in the branches of the massive atom tree atop it, and the third realm seems to be yet another atom tree growing out of the first. This could be interpreted as a symbolic climbing toward the heavens, perhaps with the idea of building ever greater societies atop the foundations of the one by which it was preceded. I've even suggested that the 3 tiers or 3 realms of Elbaf could symbolically represent the structure of the One Piece world as a whole. The underworld would be the Abyss, the Sun Realm, the Blue Seas, and the Astral Realm, Marijwa, or the Holy Land. With that said, the structure of Elbaf's 3 realms takes direct inspiration from the world tree Yggdrasil in Norse mythology, and perhaps significantly, in the foretold Battle of Ragnarok, Yggdrasil is prophesied to be uprooted with a new sapling planted in its place. On that note, the Harley text concludes not with the building of a new 4th world, but rather the world being delivered to its end. It's uncertain what that means, but for Elbaf, it could suggest that rather than planting a 4th tier growing from the astral realm, reaching further toward the heavens, the world tree atom will instead be replaced with an entirely new structure or new tree, fitting the symbolism in the legend of Ragnarok. But of course, the most interesting interpretation, in light of Xebec's words in chapter 1162, is that the 3 worlds described in the Harley text could also refer to 3 iterations of the Dark Overlord currently embodied by Lord Imu. The second world verse concludes with man claiming to have become God after slaying the sun. The death of the sun probably refers to Joy Boy's demise and the disappearance of Nika, while man ascending to become God describes the formation of the world government and the rise of the celestial dragons to live in the Holy Land of Marijwa. Ivankov revealed that Saint Nerona Imu was among the 20 kings responsible for founding the world government, so corresponding with our earlier conversation, this could mean that in ascending to so-called godhood, this once mortal king, either through being consumed entirely by the will of an awakened zone power, or perhaps by directly channeling or summoning a demon, took on the mantle of the Third World, or the third iteration of this power or entity defined as the world. By extension, this could mean that there were two prior hosts for this power or entity prior to Nerona Imu, with the second perhaps serving as the tyrannical entity of JOYBOY'S era against which the Jolly Roger was first raised. I'm not saying this with any degree of certainty, but as I've discussed in the past, I think there's a strong possibility that the 20 Kings didn't band together with evil intention. We know that among their ranks was the evil Don Quixote monarch who was first responsible for enslaving the Tontada, and based on Imu's namesake Nero, the Emperor of Rome who fiddled as his city burned, it's reasonable to assume that even if, in his present form, he's been consumed by an even more ancient evil entity or force, Nerona Imu was himself probably a wicked king, and thus became a willing host for the devil he now embodies. With that said, Nefeltari Lily was at least initially counted among the 20 monarchs who banded together in opposition to JOYBOY, so it also seems reasonable to conclude that there at least outwardly appeared to be justifiable reason for the 20 Kings alliance. Throughout the series, we've seen a fairly consistent pattern of outsider villains who exploit or worsen existing tension between two groups for their own ends. To name a few key examples, Crocodile instigated a civil war on Alabasta so that he could search for Pluton. Eneru exploited existing tension between Skypians and Shandorans to gain access to Jaya's lost Golden City, and the Kurazumi and other clans of Wano were in conflict long before Kaido's arrival. Similarly, Xebec even told Harold that the world government sits in its lofty perch and watches as the people of the world tear each other apart. By extension, I believe that the 20 Kings and the pirating world led by JOYBOY were both to some degree manipulated. While I doubt JOYBOY himself was coerced, Xebec's ancestor Davy Jones seems like a prime candidate to have been tempted into betraying JOYBOY to some extent, as we discussed earlier. I'd assume that Imu, or whatever power or entity by which he's controlled, was the one who whispered in the ears of both the 20 Kings, as well as Davy Jones or some other primordial Morganeer adversary to JOYBOY, while maintaining no true allegiance to either faction. But alternatively, this second iteration of the world could have been present during JOYBOY'S age, and perhaps it was only upon the ascension of the 20 Kings that this entity transferred hosts to Saint Nerona Imu, transforming him into the devil who now reigns in secret. If so, the second world could have been the one who tempted both the 20 Kings as well as Davy Jones. At this point, this is all speculation, but if Imu is indeed the third incarnation or iteration of the world, I think this would further point away from Blackbeard serving as the final antagonist of the series, were Blackbeard to topple the world government and become the next host for this evil entity who would become the fourth incarnation of the world. Yet the Harley text states that at the end of the Third Age, the world will be delivered to its end, which seemingly points away from a fourth iteration of the cycle. Hence, if Imu is indeed the third in a line of individuals serving as hosts to an immortal evil entity, force, or will, it's unlikely Blackbeard will become the fourth to take up its mantle, as the prophecy suggests that the third will be the last before the arrival of the New Dawn. Of course, there are many more interesting possibilities to consider, and as I said, fully dissecting the Harley is too big of a topic to tackle in this particular video, so we'll leave things here for now. But as the God Valley incident approaches its climax, we may gain deeper insight into Imu's true nature and what his being defined as the world means for the endgame of the series. With Imu now in the mix, it's an even bigger mystery how the Roger Pirates and Garp will walk away from the battle. We previously saw in Egghead that Emmet was able to use JOYBOY'S hockey knot to send the Elders back through the abyss to Marijois, so I think it's possible that Imu possessed Saturn's primary function will be to catalyze a transformation or awakening in Xebec, but perhaps by similar means will be returned to Marijois before the climactic battle between Roger, Garp, and Xebec. Chapter 1163 opens on the town center on God Valley, as Imu, looking down on these so-called nuisances who stand before him, attacks both Marines and pirates alike. While we've already seen the world government's leaders and Celestial Dragons show general indifference toward the lives of their Marine subordinates, willing to accept their deaths as collateral damage in pursuit of their own targets, here we see Imu not only fail to distinguish between friend and foe, but actively target both pirate and Marine. This reinforces much of what I said in the conversation about Chapter 1162, regarding Imu's position not as the leader of the world government, but rather one who stands above this global apparatus which serves as nothing more than a tool to help him achieve his ultimate yet unrealized ambition. When Imu finally achieves his true objective, much like Eneru, even his own subordinates are likely to be cast aside once their usefulness expires. As Roger and Garp make their way toward the island's center, we learn through conversation that Garp has never seen the Elders in person before, but here see even further just how vehement his hatred is toward the Celestial Dragons, which, while fully deserved based solely on their behaviors and actions in general, it makes me wonder what Garp's personal experience has been in the past with the world nobles to create such disdain. We then cut to Xebec directly confronting Imu, as he calls him the king of the Bildrats. Cryptically, Imu refers to Xebec as Davy Jones, to which Xebec replies that he's got the wrong guy, as he's never met Davy Jones in person. Both in my analysis of Chapter 1162 as well as my previous videos, I've discussed the possibility that not only Davy Jones' will, but also some power he possessed, or even his very soul, could have been passed down to Xebec or potentially Blackbeard. Even in the legend of Davy Jones, Robin told Chopper in Chapter 306, Davy Jones isn't said to have been killed, but rather cast to the bottom of the sea to live forever in the crushing depths. This exchange of dialogue may offer further evidence in support of those ideas, as Imu here doesn't refer to Xebec as merely the descendant of Davy Jones or heir to his will, but rather Davy Jones himself. At the very least, Xebec being referred to as Davy Jones in the present is similar to Luffy being called Joy Boy for having awakened Nika and inherited Joy Boy's will, despite the fact that Joy Boy was a distinct historical figure. I suppose it's possible that Luffy is in fact a reincarnated Joy Boy, and thus, by extension, Xebec, or more probably Teach, could be a reincarnated Davy Jones. But personally, I think that's a pretty big stretch, and seems uncharacteristic of Oda's writing. Rather, as covered in the discussion of Chapter 1162, I think it's more probable that some latent power once possessed by Davy Jones, much like Shirahoshi's ability to communicate with Sea Kings, now lies dormant in Xebec or Teach, but will soon be awakened. It's interesting that Imu, almost certain to have lived during the Void Century, refers to Xebec as Davy Jones, considering that this infamous pirate seemingly was a pivotal figure during the same time Imu rose to power. This could mean that Imu never met Davy Jones directly, but could also signify that Imu merely sees the potential for Xebec to awaken the dormant power or ability which once belonged to Davy Jones. Again, in the same manner Luffy's Nika awakening caused some like Kaido to call him Joy Boy. A third possibility, as mentioned earlier, is the idea that Nerona Imu became the third world upon ascension of the world government at the end of the Void Century, with the second world, a prior host to the demonic entity or power now residing in Nerona Imu, having been the one to meet Davy Jones, who lived in Joy Boy's era. At the very least, I think this exchange verifies my belief that Joy Boy and Davy Jones were in fact two distinct individuals. Xebec responds that promises are meant to be kept, referencing both his direct challenge to Imu in the Chamber of Flowers 18 years prior during the Reverie, but also potentially a promise made by Davy Jones to Imu, who were a prior host to this dark entity 8 centuries prior. An enraged Imu agrees with Xebec's assertion, and states that for that very reason, the Davy clan must be eliminated. This reinforces my belief that Davy D. Xebec, potentially a crewmate or ally to Joy Boy, served as a traitor during the Void Century, perhaps promising to deliver an ancient weapon, Joy Boy himself, or even the One Piece into Imu's hands. Much as Judas Iscariot betrayed Jesus, but later regretted his actions and tried returning the 30 pieces of silver received in payment, Davy Jones reneged on his deal with the devil. While this betrayal may have doomed Joy Boy during the Void Century, Davy Jones also failed to deliver on the promise he made to Lord Imu, which again seems to be overtly verified on the following page, as Imu then blames this broken promise for the fact that his world remains incomplete. The implication of this exchange of dialogue is that Davy Jones broke a promise to Imu, and resultantly, Imu's world remains incomplete, again using the term world, which itself has some interesting connotations in the context of that which we learned in Chapter 1162. It's also important to note that Imu's claim that his world remains incomplete also verifies exactly what I've been saying, not only in the analysis of 1162 and in other recent videos, but for many, many years, that the true history reveals not only what happened in the distant past, but also an ongoing, yet to be completed plot to gain complete dominion over the world. Despite the ascension of the world government and Joy Boy's downfall at the end of the Void Century, Imu doesn't yet possess all that he desires, and accordingly, the true history on Laugh Tale will reveal both the underpinnings of this ancient conflict, as well as the shape of things to come, as Imu moves closer to completing his master plan. In the next scene, Captain John uses his magnet power to gather all the island's treasure toward himself as he plans to make his break from the Rock's pirates, where Kaido and Whitebeard chose to stand by Xebec's side. Even without anything to personally gain in doing so, it seems the lesser Rock's members, like John, Gansui, and even Shiki, are planning to make their own escape from God Valley, taking as much loot as they can as they leave their captain Xebec to his own fate. Of course, the infighting among members of Rocks continues, as Gansui and Shiki both make their attempts to steal back the treasure from John, though the fact that Buggy continues to search for John's famous treasure in the present would seemingly indicate that despite his apparent defeat at the hands of Gansui, John will still walk away with the lion's share of the silver and gold accumulated on God Valley. Then again, this scene could simply represent the birth of the legend of Captain John's treasure, with many perhaps assuming he walked away with a mountain of gold, despite the fact that it was in truth stolen away from him soon afterward. I guess at this point time will tell, though it's important to note that Sengoku said John would be one of the pirates to go on and make a name for himself after the fall of Rocks, so surely this event won't mark his ultimate demise. As a brief throwaway theory, I wonder if the mountain of gold we assume to be Captain John's treasure, based on this chapter, will in fact be stolen away by Shiki or one of the other Rocks pirates. Perhaps then John will go his entire life without claiming a fortune for himself, but will leave behind a child born a year prior to the God Valley incident whom he will recognize as his only true treasure. Or put simply, in an ironic twist, maybe Baby Buggy is Captain John's real treasure. We also learn through this scene that Gansui seems to possess Mr. Five's Devil Fruit, an ability I've always considered to be highly underrated, as it could prove to be fairly powerful in the right hands. It's interesting that Gansui seems to use the same fighting technique as Mr. Five, much as Sabo echoed Ace's attack on Dressrosa after eating the Maramara fruit, perhaps reinforcing my assertion that Devil Fruit possess their own form of memory, or at the very least, that the fruit's will or dream somehow influences its wielder even in subtle ways. In my analysis of Chapter 1162, I said I was hoping to see more of the Lesser Rocks Pirates members in action, so I was pleasantly surprised to see Gansui and John given a bit of the spotlight in Chapter 1163, and accordingly, I'm hopeful that Gloriosa, Miss Buchan, Kyo, and Barbell will also be given some more panel time before the dust finally settles on God Valley. As John pulls all the metal on the island in his direction, Dragon is separated from baby Shanks, who then is seen crawling into a treasure chest just as he'll later be discovered by the Roger pirates after they make their escape from God Valley. Roger told Gaban to take as much treasure with him as he could on the way off the island, and Rayleigh later echoes the same sentiment to the other Roger pirates. So presumably Gaban, or one of the other Roger pirates, could unwittingly grab the chest containing Shanks as they race toward the Uro Jackson. I'm a bit surprised at this chain of events, as I previously suspected that Dragon would intentionally leave Shanks to be taken and discovered by Roger's crew after having seen evidence that the former Pirate King was the kind-hearted person Shanks' mother asked Dragon to find to raise her child. I suppose it's still possible that Dragon will rediscover Shanks inside the treasure chest and then choose to leave them both for the Roger pirates, but at this point that seems to be the less likely outcome. In the next scene, we see all of the most powerful warriors on the sea converge, as Roger, Xebec, Garp, Whitebeard, Kaido, and Big Mom all simultaneously land their most powerful attacks on Lord Imu in an epic double-page spread. Oda has used full double-page spreads extremely sparingly post-timeskip. The first appearance of the Five Elders in full demon form in Chapter 1110, titled Starfall, was the first since the end of Dressrosa, so while it's surprising to see used again here in Chapter 1163, it's also done so to great effect, as it really underscores the impact of what is perhaps the most devastating combined attack seen in the entire series thus far. On an unrelated note, I think it's interesting to know that Zeus, now sailing with the Straw Hats as Nami's servant, was directly witness to all of these monumental events and has directly seen Lord Imu in action. Though of course he wouldn't be able to identify him as the secret world king, at the very least, the events on Elbaf should probably seem familiar to Zeus, unless his memories have been erased at some point over the past 38 years. Of course, Imu's regenerative power allows him to escape entirely unscathed, even having been attacked by all of the world's most powerful warriors. While there's likely more behind this strange immunity to damage than raw physical power, I still suspect that Imu's ultimate demise will come through the combined efforts of Luffy and others, including Blackbeard, when the world eventually reaches its end as described in the Harley. In the final scene of chapter 1163, Imu says he sees Eris and Teach fleeing to safety in the distance, and declares that these new Davies must not be unleashed upon the world. In a rage, Xebec rises to defend his family, but Imu then replies that he won't lift a finger personally, but cruelly will instead use Xebec as the instrument of his own family's destruction, using Domi Reversi to turn Xebec into a demon. While I've pushed back on the idea that Reversi would be the cause for Xebec's fateful duel against Roger and Garp, I've also acknowledged that it is a distinct possibility. Here, of course, we see that Xebec has indeed been flipped to the dark side, and I imagine that Roger and Garp will eventually make their stand, not predicated on a desire to defeat Xebec, but tragically in order to prevent him from harming his own wife and child now that he's been turned into a demon. While this certainly seems to be the most likely outcome at this point, the one detail that still gives me pause is the fact that in doing so, Garp would be directly opposing the interests of not only the world government, but Lord Imu himself, by protecting members of the Davy clan and allowing them to escape. Of course, Garp already directly attacked Lord Imu in chapter 1163, but given the fact that Big Mom was really aiming for Kaido, Garp here at least has some plausible deniability, as he could claim he was really aiming for Roger or Xebec. I'm not really sure he would have that same wiggle room if he then goes on to defend Xebec's family. Personally, however, I'm still hoping that Xebec makes his final stand on his own terms, and that accordingly, Roger and Garp are given justifiable reason to unite and stand in his way. With all that said, it's already notable that Blackbeard betrayed Newgate, a man who was willing to stand by his father's side to the bitter end, and thus, it would be even more ironic if Ace's father Roger and Luffy's grandfather Garp were directly responsible for saving Blackbeard's life as a young child on God Valley. If so, it would even further emphasize the thematic significance of forgiveness and breaking cycles of hatred and vengeance, were Luffy and Blackbeard to ultimately someday team up to defeat Lord Imu. Imu here says that Teach and Eris cannot be allowed to escape, as these new Davies cannot be unleashed upon the world, which is perhaps significant when we consider both his reference earlier in the chapter to Xebec as Davy Jones, and Saturn's warning in chapter 1163 that the Chaos on God Valley could birth or unleash something entirely new. This is a topic I discussed at length in my analysis of chapter 1162, but I think this could be strong evidence that some power or ability once wielded by Davy Jones, or even the soul of Davy Jones himself, lies dormant in young Blackbeard. Of course, my preference is that this power, ability, will, or spirit of Davy Jones would first awaken in Xebec, allowing him to break through Imu's Reversi power, but also turning him into a grave threat which must be opposed by Roger and Garp, allowing all three to make their final stand on their own terms. Following Xebec's defeat and potentially even death at the hands of Garling, this same power would then be passed on to young Teach in the present. However, at this point I think Teach is a more likely candidate to represent the something new Saturn warned would be awakened or birthed by the chaos on God Valley. Much as Luffy represents the return of Joy Boy in his possession of the Nika Devil Fruit, Blackbeard could represent the return of Davy Jones, and thus, in accordance with what we discussed earlier, it seems likely that in attempting to eliminate this potential threat, Imu's intervention will directly cause that which he's trying to prevent. That is to say, by sending Xebec to eliminate Teach and Eris, Imu's actions may inadvertently catalyze some awakening or transformation in young Blackbeard, which ironically will turn him into one of the instruments of Imu's ultimate demise. Thank you for watching this video. If you'd like to see more videos like this in the future, please consider subscribing and make sure to hit the bell icon to be notified when they're posted. However, most importantly, let me know your thoughts down in the comments.